for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host. We have the latest on the Israeli-Gaza war. Israel has been comparing Hamas to Islamic State, to ISIS. Is that an accurate statement? Well, not necessarily. We'll get into that. We'll have an update on the services for Rosalynn Carter that were held on Tuesday. Plus, we have an update to what's happening in Ottawa County. Now a mediator is being brought in to negotiate something between the health officer, Adeline, Hambley, and the County Board of Commissioners. We will get to the latest bizarre update on that story in just a few minutes. Before we get started with today's topics, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X, the former Twitter, Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr, southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and WMTB St. Petersburg, Florida. So be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. We are recording this show on Wednesday, November 29th, 2023. Here are the latest updates involving the Israeli-Hamas war from the Associated Press. With hours left to go before a truce in Gaza expires, international mediators work to extend it to facilitate the release of militant-held hostages and Palestinians imprisoned by Israel. The ceasefire has paused the deadliest fighting between Israel and Palestinians in decades. Israel has agreed to extend the truce, which was originally set to expire on Monday, by 1 day for every 10 hostages freed, and Hamas is expected to release another group of hostages later Wednesday. 12 hostages, including 10 Israelis, were released Tuesday, bringing the total number of freed during the truce to 81. Israel has vowed to resume the war in an effort to end Hamas's 16-year rule of Gaza, but it's facing mounting international pressure to extend the truce and spare South Gaza a devastating ground offensive like the one that has demolished much of the north. Hamas's ability to negotiate and implement the ceasefire suggests that Israel's air and ground campaigns have not seriously challenged the group's control of Gaza, despite killing thousands of Palestinians and driving 3 out of 4 people in the territory from their homes. Roughly 240 hostages were captured by Hamas in its October 7th attack in southern Israel that ignited the war. More than 13,300 Palestinians have been killed since the war began, according to the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza. About 1,200 people have been killed in Israel, mostly during the initial incursion by Hamas. So here are the latest happenings from the war. Out of Brussels, Belgium, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the Biden administration would like to see a new extension of a ceasefire agreement in Israel's war with Hamas after the current one expires to secure the release of more hostages held by Hamas and to ramp up humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza. As he prepared to make his third visit to the Middle East since the war began with Hamas's October 7th attacks in Israel, Blinken said Wednesday that in addition to discussing short-term logistical and operational planning, the administration believes it is imperative to discuss ideas about the future governance of Gaza if and when Israel achieves its stated goal of eradicating Hamas. Israel and Arab nations have resisted discussions of such planning, with Israeli officials concentrating on the prosecution of the war and Arab leaders insisting the immediate priority must be ending the fighting that has killed thousands of Palestinian civilians. Blinken told reporters at a news conference in Brussels where he was attending a NATO foreign ministers meeting, quote, "Looking at the next couple of days, we'll be focused on doing what we can to extend the pause so that we can continue to get more hostages out and more humanitarian assistance in. And we'll discuss with Israel how it can achieve its objective of ensuring that the terrorist attacks of October 7th never happen again, while sustaining and increasing humanitarian assistance and minimizing further suffering of Palestinian civilians. Everyone's focused on what's happening in Gaza right now, but we also need to be focused at the same time, and we are in conversations with many other countries on what I call the day after, and the day after the day after. I mean, what happens in Gaza once the campaign is over." End of quote. Out of Ramallah, West Bank, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is calling for an international conference to resolve the Mideast conflict. He said Wednesday that the Palestinians are ready to work with the international community on a serious political process that leads to an independent state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, territories Israel seized in the 1967 Mideast War. He also again called for a halt to the war in Gaza. Abbas's Palestinian Authority and ministers part of the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Hamas drove his forces out of Gaza when it seized power there in 2007. Abbas is extremely unpopular among Palestinians, many of whom view the Palestinian Authority as an accomplice to the Israeli occupation because it coordinates with Israel on security matters. The U.S. has said a revitalized Palestinian Authority should govern Gaza and the West Bank as part of an eventual two-state solution to the decades-old conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected that idea, and his government is strongly opposed to Palestinian statehood. Yeah, because Netanyahu is basically Israel's version of Donald Trump. Sorry, he is. And he's a war criminal on top of it. My opinion. The last serious Israeli-Palestinian peace talks broke down more than a decade ago. Out of Tel Aviv, there are approximately 161 hostages still in captivity in Gaza, according to Israeli government spokesperson Elon Levy on Wednesday. That includes 146 Israelis and 15 foreigners, of whom 126 are men, 35 women. There are still 4 children under the age of 18, 10 people aged 75 and older. It's unclear how many of the hostages are soldiers. Levy said at a news conference, quote, "We want to get all of the hostages home. We're committed to that pledge. There will be no one left behind. The current framework allows for a few more days of hostage relief pause, and as long as there is a serious offer on the table to release the remaining hostages as we are demanding, we will of course consider every serious proposal because we're committed to doing everything to bring them back." End of quote. Out of Cairo, Egypt, the head of the World Health Organization warned on Wednesday that more people in the Gaza Strip could die from disease than from bombing. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, WHO's Director General, said there is a heightened risk of disease outbreaks because of overcrowded shelters and a lack of food, water, sanitation, and medication. He said that 111,000 people are suffering from respiratory infections, 75,000 others from diarrhea, more than half of them under the age of 5. He added, quote, "Given the living conditions and lack of health care, more people could die from disease than bombings. It's a matter of life and death for civilians." End of quote. He also called for a sustained ceasefire. According to the United Nations, up to 1.8 million people, about 80% of Gaza's population, has been displaced because of the war. Now just think about that. 80% of 300 million, which is the population of this country, is 240 million. Imagine 240 million people displaced in this country because of war. That's what's happening in Gaza right now. Really, you need to think about that. You need to think about things on our level. What would happen if that was us? Maybe then you'll have some empathy for other countries and other people, especially people who have brown skin. Out of Cairo, Palestinians in Gaza fear a resumption of the Israel-Hamas war, which has brought unprecedented levels of death, destruction, and displacement in the impoverished coastal strip. Omar al-Dawari, who works at the overwhelmed Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in the central town of Deir al-Balah, said, quote, "We are fed up. We want this war to stop," end of quote. Ihab Abu Auf, a father of three staying with another family in southern Gaza, said he tried twice to return to his home in the north but was turned back by Israeli troops. The two men spoke Wednesday as international mediators worked to extend the ceasefire that has paused the fighting for nearly a week. Both said it would be catastrophic if Israel resumes its offensive and sends troops south, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have sought refuge. Abu Auf said, quote, "They want another Nakba," end of quote. Nakba means catastrophe. That's referring to the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were fled or driven out of what's now Israel during the 1948 war surrounding its creation. Egypt has refused to accept Palestinian refugees, and Israel has sealed its borders since the start of the war, which was triggered by Hamas's deadly October 7th cross-border attack. I don't know why they keep focusing on that. The war started in 1947 when British-occupied Palestine was taken away from the Palestinians and given to Jews. That's how this all started. You need to look at your history, folks, period. Oh, but Israel was promised that by God himself, Jesus Christ, and blah, 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 blah. Once again, I will say a book of fiction written 2,000 years ago to control other men and all women. There you go, folks. I don't believe that hokey crap. Out of Ankara, Turkey, Turkish President Erdogan on Wednesday accused Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of committing one of the worst atrocities of the century and said he would go down in history as the butcher of Gaza. Erdogan, an outspoken critic of Israel's military actions in Gaza, also said his government would ensure that Israel is held accountable for its actions before international courts. In his biweekly address to governing party legislators, Erdogan maintained that Israel's actions were fueling anti-Semitism while Western leaders were stoking hatred toward Islam. Erdogan said, quote, "With the murders he committed in Gaza, Netanyahu is firing up anti-Semitism and endangering the security of the people of Israel and of all Jewish people. Immigrants living in Western countries are paying the price for the irresponsible rhetoric of Western leaders that demonize Palestinians," end of quote. Out of Tel Aviv, 4-year-old Abigail Eden was discharged from the hospital late Tuesday night following her release after more than 50 days as a hostage in Gaza. That is according to a spokesperson for Schneider Children's Medical Center in Petah Tikva. The Israeli-American dual citizen was the first U.S. hostage to be released under the ceasefire. Abigail marked her 4th birthday in captivity. Both of her parents were killed in the Hamas attack that started the war on October 7th. During the rampage, she ran to a neighbor's home for shelter, and the Broduk's family took her in before militants took the family to Gaza. Hagar Broduk and her 3 children were also released on Sunday. President Joe Biden celebrated her release, telling reporters, quote, "I wish I were there to hold her," end of quote. Out of Manila, Philippines, a Filipino-Israeli woman arrived in Israel after being released by Hamas on Tuesday night as part of a group of 12 hostages, according to the Philippine president announcement on Social Security early Wednesday. Noraline Babadia was the second of 2 Filipinos released from captivity in Gaza during the truce in the Israel-Hamas war. President Ferdinand Marcos said with her release, quote, "All Filipinos affected by the war have been accounted for," end of quote. Babadia, who lived in Israel and worked as a caregiver, was visiting friends in Kibbutz Nirim with her husband during the October 7th attack. Her husband, Gideon Babani, was killed during the attack. Babadia was taken hostage. Ferdinand Marcos thanked Israel for facilitating Babadia's release and thanked Egypt and Qatar, which helped mediate the ceasefire, quote, for their crucial role in this process over the past several weeks, end of quote. Meanwhile, out of Washington, the group of 7 foreign ministers of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain, and the U.S., as well as the High Representative of the European Union, are calling for the unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and the facilitated departure of foreign nationals from Gaza, according to a statement released by the U.S. State Department. The G7 also said it supports the further extension of the current pause in fighting. The statement said, quote, we remain steadfast in our commitment to work with all partners in the region to prevent the conflict from escalating further, end of quote. Also out of Washington, D.C., White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Tuesday that the U.S. has airlifted over 54,000 pounds of Gaza-bound medical items and food aid to a staging area in Egypt. 2 more airlifts are planned in the coming days, according to Sullivan. Since October 21st, more than 2,000 trucks have delivered aid to Gaza. So there's the latest on what's happening with the Israel-Hamas war. Now let's get into a little bit of a deeper analysis by the Associated Press. This is Joseph Fetterman writing for them on November 29th. The headline reads this way: Israel compares Hamas to the Islamic State group, but the comparison misses the mark in key ways. So this is an interesting story. This is out of Jerusalem. It has become an Israeli mantra throughout the latest war in Gaza: Hamas is ISIS. Since the bloody Hamas attack on October 7th that triggered the conflict, Israeli leaders and commanders have likened the Palestinian militant group to the Islamic State group in virtually every speech and public statement. They point to Hamas's slaughter of hundreds of civilians and compare their mission to defeat Hamas to the U.S.-led campaign to defeat ISIS in Israel and Syria. But in many ways, these comparisons miss the mark by ignoring the homegrown origins and base of support for Hamas in Palestinian society, and by assuming that this deeply embedded movement can be stamped out like brush fire. These miscalculations may have already led to unrealistic expectations in Israel for victory. They also complicate fledgling efforts by the U.S. and other international mediators to end the war, which has devastated Gaza, displaced more than 3/4 of its population, and killed over 13,300 Palestinians, according to health authorities in the Hamas-ruled territory. Here's a closer look at the campaign against these very different militant groups and what it could mean for Israel's ground invasion and the future of Gaza. Is Hamas the same as the Islamic State group? The violent images of October 7th brought to mind the scenes of cruelty unleashed by the Islamic State group during its short self-declared caliphate in Iraq and Syria nearly a decade ago. In an unprecedented attack, Hamas fighters burst into Israeli communities, killing entire families as they cowered in their homes, burning people alive and taking some 240 hostages, including older people and young children. Israeli authorities say at least 1,200 people were killed, some of whom were mutilated so badly they still have not been identified. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared just after the attack, quote, Hamas is ISIS. And just as the forces of civilization united to defeat ISIS, the forces of civilization must support Israel in defeating Hamas, end of quote. While the Islamic State group also carried out gruesome killings, including beheading and setting live prisoners on fire, that is where many of the similarities end. ISIS fighters were mostly Iraqi and Syrian, but the group also managed to attract thousands of recruits for its global jihadi movement from around the world, including Europe, Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and the former Soviet Union. These foreigners often did not speak the local language, were seen as outsiders, and disliked by the local communities. In contrast, Hamas is an exclusively Palestinian movement. Its members are Palestinian, and its ideology, albeit violent, is focused on liberating what it says is occupied land through the destruction of Israel. Hamas seized control of Gaza from the internationally recognized Palestinian Authority in 2007, a year after trouncing the Palestinian Authority's Fatah rulers in legislative elections. During its 16 years of rule, Hamas built up a system of government that includes not only its military wing, but also tens of thousands of teachers, civil servants, and police. The group has also significant support inside the West Bank and an exiled leadership spread out across the Arab world. A U.S.-led coalition defeated ISIS in Iraq in 2017 and in Syria 2 years later, though the group still has thousands of fighters in sleeper cells in both countries. Eradicating Hamas could be a much tougher task. Israel has already backed away from its initial pledges to wipe Hamas off the face of the earth. But given Hamas's deep roots, even its current goals of destroying the Hamas's military and governing capabilities in Gaza still may be too ambitious. Michael Milstein, an expert on Palestinian affairs at Tel Aviv University and former head of the Palestinian desk in Israel's military intelligence, said the comparisons of Hamas to ISIS work in a limited context but otherwise are misleading. He said, quote, "I do think that the slogan is right when you were trying to express and reflect the brutality of Hamas, but of course we're speaking about different entities," end of quote. What is the future of Hamas? Hamas was established during the first Palestinian uprising against Israel occupation in the late 1980s and has survived repeated assassinations of its top leaders and 4 previous wars with Israel since 2008. While Israel claims to have inflicted heavy damage on the group during the latest war, much of its fighting force and network of tunnels appear to remain intact. Its exiled leadership maintains working relations with key countries like Egypt and Qatar. Nathan Brown, an expert on Hamas, said he doesn't see any way in which Hamas can be eradicated. Quote, "By continually talking this way, the Israeli leadership is not just setting up expectations, but really, I think, digging themselves into a hole," end of quote. Israel has laid out its security demands for a post-war Gaza, but offered no plan for who might run the territory. Brown, a political science professor at George Washington University, said that after a bruising war, Hamas may be forced to reinvent itself, perhaps by controlling local residents' committees or going back to being an underground militant group. But he said it will maintain some perspective of presence while remaining active in the West Bank and continuing to be a regional player. He said, quote, "Hamas will be there," end of quote. Israel's ambitious goals against Hamas have complicated the task of the U.S. as it works with Qatari and Egyptian mediators to end the war. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is expected in the region later this week to discuss, among other things, the principles for a post-war Gaza. For now, Israel remains committed to its goals. Netanyahu has vowed to strike Hamas with Israel's full force as soon as the ceasefire expires. This would mean an expansion of Israel's ground offensive into southern Gaza, where the vast majority of the territory's population is now concentrated, setting the stage for a complicated and bloody operation. The U.S., which initially backed Israel's war in Gaza, is now pressing Israel to avoid large-scale civilian casualties or mass displacement if the fighting resumes. But with the war enjoying broad support among the Israeli public, Blinken faces a difficult task. Although diplomatic efforts are focused on extending the ceasefire, any formula to end the war would have to allow Israel to declare victory, even if Hamas remains intact. Milstein said toppling Hamas's government and destroying its army remain feasible objectives, but he believes there is a growing awareness among Israeli decision-makers that, quote, "we cannot really make this organization vanish," end of quote. So there it is, the differences between Hamas and ISIS, and they are quite a few. Right now, let's get to our next story. This is Bill Barrow and Andrew DeMillo writing for the Associated Press. This is dated November 28th out of Atlanta. Rosalynn Carter was remembered Tuesday as a former U.S. First Lady who leveraged her fierce intellect and political power to put her deep Christian faith into action by always helping others, especially those who needed it most. A gathering of First Ladies and Presidents, including her 99-year-old husband Jimmy Carter, joined other political figures in tribute, but a parade of speakers said her global stature wasn't what defined her. Her son, James Earl Chip Carter III, said, quote, "She had met kings and queens, presidents, others in authority, powerful corporate leaders, and celebrities. She said the people that she felt the most comfortable with and the people she enjoyed being with the most were those that lived in absolute abject poverty, the ones without adequate housing, without a proper diet, and without access to health care," end of quote. The service was held during the 3 days of events celebrating the humanitarian who died November 19th at home in Plains, Georgia, at the age of 96. Tributes began Monday in the Carter's native Sumner County and continued at Glen Memorial Church in Atlanta. Her funeral and burial are planned for Wednesday in her small hometown. Jimmy Carter, who was 10 months into a home hospice care, watched from his wheelchair, reclining and covered by a blanket featuring his wife's face. Chip and his sister Amy held their father's hands and were flanked by their brothers, Jeff and Jack. And by the way, I want to stop right here. I couldn't help but to cry, looking at how bad of a shape Jimmy Carter is in. It is really sad to see him in such a state of decline. And I'm going to once again say something that I've said on this show 100 times. Jimmy Carter, without a doubt, the greatest president of my lifetime. Yes, better than LBJ, better than Obama, much better than Bill Clinton. Jimmy Carter cared about people, and he never got the U.S. in a war. Oh, but inflation was double-digit mortgages. Yeah, and people could pay for double-digit mortgages back then. Oh, bread was $2 a loaf back then. It's $2 a loaf plus now, and people can't afford it. People could afford it back then because they had good-paying jobs, and they weren't getting screwed by bosses who make a lot more money now than they ever have. That's just the truth, folks. Don't listen to these conservatives who only tell you half the story, and the half that they tell you is utter bullshit. I'm sorry, I lived that era. I know what I'm talking about. Let me continue. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden, the Carters' longtime friends, joined them in the front row, along with former President Bill Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and the other living former First Ladies, Melania Trump, Michelle Obama, and Laura Bush. Vice President Kamala Harris and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff paid their respects, as did Georgia's U.S. Senators and Governor Brian Kemp and his wife Marty. More than 1,000 people, including a sizable contingent of Secret Service agents, filled the sanctuary. Former Presidents Donald Trump, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush were invited but did not attend. Chip Carter said, quote, "My mother was the glue that held our family together through the ups and downs and thicks and thins of our family's politics," end of quote. The pews filled with political power players, but front and center were all her children and dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all surrounding Jimmy Carter, her partner of 77 years. Amy Carter, who read a love note her father wrote to her mother 75 years ago, said, quote, "Their partnership and love story was a defining feature of her life," end of quote. Journalist Judy Woodruff recalled Rosalynn Carter lobbying lawmakers, campaigning separately from her husband, attending cabinet meetings and playing key roles, including being the first presidential advisor to suggest Camp David as a negotiating place for Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin. Those negotiations led to historic peace accords between the two countries. Woodruff, who covered the Carter administration for NBC News, said, quote, "Without Rosalynn Carter, I don't believe there would have been a President Carter," end of quote. It was Jimmy Carter's first public appearance since he entered hospice care, other than a brief ride with Rosalynn in September's Plains Peanut Festival parade, where they were visible only through the open windows of a Secret Service vehicle. He was with his wife during her final hours, but did not appear publicly during earlier events at her alma mater, Georgia Southwestern State University in Americus, and at his presidential library. Carter Center CEO Paige Alexander said, quote, "He never wants to be very far from her," end of quote. The trip to Atlanta was hard for the former president, but she added, quote, "This is her last trip up, and it's probably his too. He's determined," end of quote. The Carters married in 1946 and became the longest married presidential couple in U.S. history. Jimmy Carter is the longest-lived president. Rosalynn Carter was the second longest-lived First Lady, trailing only Bess Truman, who died at 97. Family members described how Rosalynn Carter went from growing up in a small town where she had never spoken to a group larger than her Sunday school class to being a global figure who visited more than 120 countries. Catherine Cade, who stayed on as a close advisor as Rosalynn Carter helped build the Carter Center and its global reach, called Rosalynn Carter's time as First Lady, quote, really just one chapter in a life that was about caring for others, end of quote. Praise for her half-century of advocating for better mental health care in America and reducing stigmas attached to mental illness, she brought attention to the tens of millions of people who work as unpaid caregivers in U.S. households and was acclaimed for how integral she was to her husband's political rise in his terms as Georgia governor and the 39th president. Chip Carter recalled how his mom got him into rehab for drug and alcohol addiction. He said, quote, my mother was the most beautiful woman I ever met and pretty to look at, too, end of quote. Jason Carter, her grandson, got laughs as he acknowledged the remarkable sisterhood of the first ladies in attendance and then greeted the lovely husbands of Hillary Clinton and Jill Biden. As he shared family stories, including the time when his grandmother made pimento cheese sandwiches and handed them out on a Delta flight, Jason Carter said, quote, she was so down to earth, y'all, it was amazing. She loved people. She was a cool grandma, end of quote. Country music stars Garth Brooks and Trisha Yearwood, family friends of the Carters, and their successors as Habitat for Humanity ambassadors, performed a rendition of John Lennon's Imagine toward the end of the service. Though the president did not speak at the service, he and his wife shared a private moment with Jimmy Carter beforehand, according to White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. Jean-Pierre said that Joe and Jill Biden, quote, were able to express their condolences directly to the Carter family, end of quote. She added that the Bidens hold, quote, the entire Carter family close to their hearts, end of quote. Rosalynn Carter's funeral has taken place Wednesday in Plains, Georgia, with an invitation-only service at Maranatha Baptist Church, where the Carters have been members since returning to Georgia after his presidency. She will be buried after a private graveside service in a plot the couple will share, visible from the front porch of the home they built before Jimmy Carter's first political campaign in 1962. I'm not a very religious person, but God bless Jimmy Carter. Again, probably the greatest president of my lifetime. Speaking of presidents, Donald Trump could be really agitated right now because Americans for Prosperity, or as we call them on this show, assholes fucking the poor, have endorsed Nikki Haley to be the next Republican president of the United States. They have bypassed Trump. We have this story. This is Steve Peoples writing for the Associated Press. This is dated November 28th out of New York. Americans for Prosperity, again, assholes fucking the poor, the political arm of the powerful Koch network, formally endorsed Nikki Haley's presidential campaign on Tuesday, promising to commit its nationwide coalition of activists and virtually unlimited funds to help Haley defeat Donald Trump in the GOP primary contest. In a memo announcing the group's decision, AFP President and CEO Emily Seidel wrote, quote, AFP Action is proud to throw our full support behind Nikki Haley, who offers America the opportunity to turn the page on the current political era to win the Republican primary and defeat Joe Biden next November. She has what it takes to lead a policy agenda to take on our nation's biggest challenges and help ensure our country's best days are ahead. With the grassroots and data capability we bring to bear in this race, no other organization is better equipped to help her do it. End of quote. The endorsement may help Haley address one of her biggest strategic liabilities. Despite seizing some political momentum in recent months, especially in early primary states, the former United Nations ambassador's campaign has been lacking significant resources on the ground to ensure her supporters turn out to vote. But now she inherits the organizational heft of what may be the most powerful conservative grassroots organization in the nation. The Koch network, previously referred to as the Koch brothers, has been building a network of paid conservative activists and volunteers in key states for several years. Throughout last summer and the fall alone, AFP activists communicated with 6 million primary voters either in person at their doors or on the phone. That's according to their president and CEO, Emily Seidel. The endorsement marks a particularly painful blow to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who had championed conservative priorities in Florida, but struggled to emerge as the clear Trump alternative in the 2024 GOP primary contest. It's unclear, however, whether the endorsement can help weaken Trump's grip on the Republican presidential nomination, given his commanding lead over DeSantis and Haley in virtually every poll. Back in the spring, the Koch network began running ads across Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, the first 3 states on the Republicans' presidential primary calendar, focusing on questions about Trump's electability in next fall's general election against Biden. And still, Trump remains the overwhelming frontrunner in the race. Yeah, that's called cognitive dissonance. And for that matter, it's also confirmation bias, all wrapped into one big orange bundle known as Trump. Seidel said Tuesday that AFP would immediately begin refocusing its efforts on boosting Haley's primary and general election campaigns with strategic advertising investments, mailers, and voter contacts throughout the group's network of thousands of conservative activists, which has spent recent months collecting information from Republican primary voters to determine the most effective arguments against Trump. So they're working against him actively. This is great. At the same time, Seidel said that her organization would focus on persuading reliable general election voters who typically don't vote in primaries to show up for Haley's in this year's fast-approaching nomination contests. Trump campaign spokesperson Stephen Chung dismissed AFP as, quote, the political arm of the China First, America Last movement, end of quote. Once again, Trump lies, but we'll take it. In a statement responding to the Haley endorsement, Chung wrote, quote, no amount of shady money from George Soros, Democrats, and never Trump rhinos in partnership with endless war swamp creatures in Washington will stop the MAGA movement or Donald Trump from being the Republican nominee and defeating crooked Joe Biden, end of quote. In the actual statement, he refers to Trump as president. We don't refer to Trump as president on this show, not in the past, present, or future. F*** him. Oh, God. The feud between Trump and the Koch network has been years in the making. The Kochs, long demonized by Democrats for having outsized influence in Washington, refused to support Trump's re-election in 2020. The group's leaders argued that his populist policies, especially on trade, didn't adhere to traditional conservative values while decrying his divisive leadership style. News of the endorsement Tuesday quickly rippled across the political world. Speaking in Washington, Utah Senator Mitt Romney predicted it would be a huge boost to Haley's campaign. Romney, a vocal Trump critic, said Haley has proved naysayers wrong before, quote, and she's doing it again. I think it's a huge boost for her campaign and may create the kind of momentum she needs, end of quote. The death sentence campaign was not pleased. In a statement, death sentence spokesperson Andrew Romeo likened the Koch endorsement to a contribution to the Trump campaign. So here we go again, the 11th commandment being tossed out the window, just like a baby with the bathwater. Oh my gosh, thou shalt never speak ill of another Republican. Well, this is beautiful. I love when the 11th commandment is just totally forgotten. Romeo wrote on X, formerly known as Twitter, quote, congratulations to Donald Trump on securing the Koch endorsement. Like clockwork, the pro-open borders, pro-jailbreak bill establishment is lining up behind a moderate who has no mathematical pathway of defeating Trump. They refer to him as former president. We don't refer to him as such. Continuing the quote, every dollar spent on Nikki Haley's candidacy should be reported as an in-kind to the Trump campaign. No one has a stronger record of beating the establishment than Ron DeSantis, and this time will be no different. End of quote. Yet the Koch network is convinced that Haley is better positioned to defeat Trump and Biden than death sentence. In a polling memo, senior advisor Michael Palmer highlighted Haley's, quote, sustained momentum in recent months, end of quote, while noting that many primary voters in Iowa and New Hampshire are only just beginning to pay close attention to the contest. Seidel, the president and CEO of AFP, said in a Tuesday conference call, quote, Governor death sentence has been a tremendous leader for the state of Florida, but all of the evidence we've already shared on this call point to the fact that Nikki Haley is the strongest candidate in this race, and that's why we decided to support her, end of quote. Meanwhile, Haley said she was honored to have the support of AFP, quote, including its millions of grassroots members all across the country, end of quote. In a statement, she said, quote, AFP Actions members know that there's too much at stake in this election to sit on the sidelines. This is a choice between freedom and socialism, individual liberty and big government, fiscal responsibility and spiraling debt. We have a country to save, and I'm grateful to have AFP Action by our side, end of quote. Yeah. Oh, boy. So, yeah, AFP, which is really not a grassroots movement. It's more of an astroturf movement. It's made to look like a grassroots, but it has big money behind it. Koch brothers. That's all that it is, folks. It's a astroturf group. It really is. Grassroots activism, my ass. All right, let's get to our next story. The latest updates on what's happening in Ottawa County involving the Board of Commissioners and their health officer. This is Anna Skog and Rachel Van Gilder writing for Wood Television out of Olive Township, Michigan. This is dated November 28th. There's also reporting on the article from Byron Tollefson and Taylor Morris. A mediator will help the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners and the county's top health officer, Adeline Hambley, reach a settlement over her lawsuit and employment. A subcommittee of 5 commissioners will sit in on mediation, and they are Chair Joe Moss, Vice Chair Sylvia Rodea, Gretchen Cosby, better known as Nurse Ratchet, Allison Miedema, and Democrat Doug Zylstra, the only Democrat on the board. A hearing for Hambley's removal will be in recess without a date to resume while mediation is underway. Moss said he will issue a notice when a date is set. Both Hambley's attorney Sarah Riley Howard and the county's attorney David Coleman said getting a mediator involved was the right thing to do after several days of negotiation without a resolution. Sarah Riley Howard said, quote, if they're willing to mediate, I will accept that as hopefully moving in a good direction and will make every attempt to work with them on it, end of quote. Coleman said, quote, I believe it's a positive direction, it's a positive step, and it's a good faith step by the board to show that they are really serious about trying to resolve issues, end of quote. No, if they were really serious, they wouldn't have started the issues in the first place, and since they've already created them, they'd pay her out the $4 million that they promised her. Continuing. But Howard expressed some concern with how the subcommittee, which makes recommendations, not decisions, would work with a mediator. Howard said, quote, the fact is, whenever you're negotiating with a board, typically you have to have faith that whoever's negotiating on behalf of the board knows that the board is going to approve what they're recommending, the agreement that's been come to. In a typical sense, it has to be voted on in a public meeting. Here, I don't know if the subcommittee they've appointed, if they agree to something, if they'll come back and the board will deny that or say that we're not interested in agreeing to what the subcommittee's approved. So that's the problem here, end of quote. Coleman seemed to have faith that the subcommittee was a good representation of the board. Of course he would. He's sucking up their money. Quote, this subcommittee cannot agree to anything. All they can do is make a recommendation and then it comes back to the full board for a vote. But with 5 people on the subcommittee, we would hope that the entire board would go along with whatever recommendation that is made, end of quote. Doug Zylstra of Holland is the lone Democrat on the board as well as the subcommittee. Coleman said, quote, I think it sends a message and it's very important that this is a bipartisan committee. By having bipartisan 4-1. Really? By having Doug Zylstra on the committee to have his voice heard and others, I think that's important. And again, I think that demonstrates the good faith in the board. End of quote. No, if they wanted to have a bipartisan subcommittee, they would have also gotten Ken Bergman, who is the moderate Republican, and make that a 3-2, not 4-1 OI against one Democrat. What could happen is anyone's guess. It won't even necessarily be a settlement. The county's lawyer says it's even possible Hambley could remain health officer just weeks after commissioners considered firing her. Coleman said, quote, I think anything's on the table. It could go 100 different ways until we get into the mediation and see, end of quote. Hambley's attorney said if she's going to remain health officer, she needs to know she won't face another termination hearing. Howard said, quote, I think if we're talking about an agreement where my client comes back, she's going to need some protection that she's not going to be facing another termination hearing in a month. If they're not willing to offer that protection, that's not going to be a deal we're interested in, end of quote. Yeah, it's a non-starter. It really is a non-starter. Howard and Coleman suspected deciding on a mediator would take 6 to 8 weeks and a date could be booked sometime in January. The county will pay for the mediator, Coleman said, but he did not outline a specific cost. He added, quote, sure, there's a cost in the sense of paying a mediator, but in the big scheme of things, it's a very small cost. You know, as opposed to going to trial and all the litigation that you've all seen going on right now. It's way less costly to do it this way, especially if it achieves the result which everybody wants, is a reasonable resolution that all sides can live with, end of quote. Michael McDaniel, the professor at Western Michigan Cooley Law School and an experienced mediator, said it's common in the cases to use a mediator. He said, quote, I would think that the judge sitting in Ottawa County on this case would welcome any sort of alternative dispute resolution here. Takeaways from this are that both parties seem to have reasons to want to resolve this issue. That's a very good thing, I think, for the citizens of Ottawa County to know. End of quote. McDaniel also explained how the mediator can insist and persuade, but they can't rule or make any decisions. He added, quote, they are there to get both parties in the same room talking about the issues, identifying those issues and identifying what each party needs to be able to resolve the case, end of quote. He said having the subcommittee sit in on the mediation may provide some bumps in the road. McDaniel added, quote, that strikes me as it may make it more difficult factually and perhaps legally to resolve this thing if you got 5 members of the Board of Commissioners there. Overall, the process, I will say it is not so much dramatic as incremental, end of quote. So let me remind everybody how they've gotten to this point. The hearing for Hambley's removal started more than a month ago and has slogged on across 6 non-consecutive days. County commissioners spent 2 of those days in closed session negotiating with Hambley's attorney about the possibility of a settlement. It resumed Tuesday afternoon at the County Administration Building in West Olive, with commissioners immediately entering closed session. After a few hours, they came back out and announced they were getting a mediator. Hambley's lawyer, Sarah Riley Howard, has filed a motion asking a judge to force the county into a $4 million payout to her client. Howard argued that she and her client believed the deal had been reached, but that county leaders tried to back out because of negative backlash to details of the settlement that were published in the press. The county's attorney Coleman said nobody ever agreed to anything. He said emails that Howard pointed to as proof of a deal were tentative only and didn't go to the board. A hearing on the motion was supposed to happen Monday, but was delayed until next week because the judge needed time to review additional motions. Coleman told reporters Monday that there could be negotiations on a different settlement agreement, but that $4 million was too much. Quite truthfully, my opinion at this point, she ought to sue him for $400 million and bankrupt him. I'm sorry. They've given her that many headaches. She deserves the money. Period. End of story. Coleman said, quote, obviously a global settlement of everything, burying the hatchet and moving forward, I think a lot of people believe that would be best here at this point. But it's not possible when you have requests for $8 million, $4.5 million, $4 million, end of quote. Howard confirmed that she initially asked for $8 million. Asked if Hambley would accept anything less than $4 million at this point, Howard said she couldn't say. Quote, I can't really discuss the views of my client on that, and it's really hard to know what the other side could offer, what you could come up with that might be acceptable, end of quote. She said discussions about a solution in which Hambley would remain in her job and be protected going forward have gone nowhere. Conservative county commissioners backed by Political Action Committee Ottawa Impact have been trying to oust Hambley all year. They voted in their first meeting in January to remove her from her job and put her in an interim role. She sued, saying that was illegal. Commissioners countered that she was never properly appointed by their predecessors. The Michigan Court of Appeals finally ruled that Hambley was rightfully appointed, but also that the board could fire her if it could prove cause under state law. A September document signed by Ottawa Impact co-founder and commission chair Joe Moss that prompted the removal hearing laid out a case for cause, alleging misconduct in the way she handled this year's budgeting process. The hearing got underway October 24th and included 2 days of testimony in which Hambley's lawyer tried to show her client simply wanted to ensure the Ottawa County Department of Public Health could operate properly. Hambley testified she went to the press with her concerns because she believed the general fund dollars to the agency would be limited to $2.5 million, which she said would cause it to close. Commissioners ultimately decided the health department would get about $4.8 million from the general fund. Its total allocation for the fiscal year, which started October 1st, was far less than the previous year. Commissioners debated for a while after the second day of testimony but held off voting. The following Monday, October 30th, they pushed the vote back to another week. On November 6th, they spent hours in closed session before voting to accept their lawyers' recommendations on litigation and settlement activities. Coleman told News 8 that the motion was meant to indicate discussions would continue. On November 14th, the fifth day of the hearing, commissioners spent several more hours in closed-door negotiations before recessing again. Hambley's attorney's motion to bind the board to the $4 million agreement was filed on November 16th. It says that under the settlement, Hambley would leave her position by December 15th in exchange for $4 million. Deputy Health Officer Marcia Mansoray would resign in exchange for a severance of 1 year's pay. And I'm sorry, Ottawa County agreed to it. They need to pay up. Pay it all. Every single goddamn penny of it. You agreed to it. Now you better cough it up. And finally, let's get to our last story here. This is Joey Capoletti and Allie Swenson writing for the Associated Press. This is dated November 29th out of Lansing. Michigan is joining an effort to curb deceptive uses of artificial intelligence and manipulated media through state-level policies as Congress and the Federal Elections Commission continue to debate more sweeping regulations ahead of the 2024 elections. Campaigns on the state and federal level will be required to clearly say which political advertisements airing in Michigan were created using artificial intelligence under legislation expected to be signed in the coming days by Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Democrat. It would also prohibit the use of AI-generated deepfakes within 90 days of an election without a separate disclosure identifying the media as manipulated. Deepfakes are fake media that misrepresents someone as doing or saying something they didn't. They're created using generative artificial intelligence, a type of AI that can create convincing images, videos, or audio clips in seconds. There are increasing concerns that generative AI will be used in the 2024 presidential race to mislead voters, impersonate candidates, and undermine elections on a scale and at a speed not yet seen. Candidates and committees in the race already are experimenting with the rapidly advancing technology, which can create convincing fake images, video, and audio clips in seconds, and in recent years has become cheaper, faster, and easier for the public to use. The Republican National Committee in April released an entirely AI-generated ad meant to show the future of the United States if President Joe Biden is reelected. Disclosing in small print that it was made with AI, it featured fake but realistic photos showing boarded-up storefronts, armored military patrols in the streets, and huge increases in immigration creating panic. In July, Never Back Down, a super PAC supporting Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, used an AI voice cloning tool to imitate Donald Trump's voice, making it seem like he narrated a social media post he made despite never saying the statement aloud. Oh, wow. So they're using it all over the place. Experts say these are just glimpses of what could ensue if campaigns or outside actors decide to use AI deepfakes in more malicious ways. So far, states including California, Minnesota, Texas, and Washington have passed laws regarding regulating deepfakes in political advertising. Similar legislation has been introduced in Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey, and New York, according to the nonprofit advocacy group Public Citizen. Under Michigan's legislation, any person, committee, or other entity that distributes an advertisement for a candidate would be required to clearly state if it uses generative AI. The disclosure would need to be in the same font as the majority of the text in print ads and would need to appear for at least 4 seconds in letters that are as large as the majority of any text in television ads. That is according to a legislative analysis from the State House Fiscal Agency. Deepfakes used within 90 days of the election would require a separate disclaimer informing the viewer that the content is manipulated to depict speech or conduct that did not occur. If the media is a video, the disclaimer would need to be clearly visible and appear through the video's entirety. Campaigns could face a misdemeanor punishable by up to 93 days in prison, a fine of up to $1,000 or both for the first violation of the proposed laws. The Attorney General or the candidate harmed by the deceptive media could apply to the appropriate circuit court for relief. I can see Dana Nessel going after these creeps. Federal lawmakers on both sides have stressed the importance of legislating deepfakes in political advertising and held meetings to discuss it, but Congress has not yet passed anything. Of course not, because they drag their feet on everything. A recent bipartisan Senate bill co-sponsored by Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, and others would ban materially deceptive deep fakes relating to federal candidates with exceptions for parody and satire. This political ad was a satire. I think most political ads already need to have a satire disclaimer on them. Oh, good Lord. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson flew to Washington, D.C. in early November to participate in a bipartisan discussion on AI and elections and called on senators to pass Klobuchar and Hawley's Federal Deceptive AI Act. Benson said she also encouraged senators to return home and lobby their state lawmakers to pass similar legislation that makes sense for their states. Federal law is limited in its ability to regulate AI at the state and local levels, Benson said in an interview, adding that states also need federal funds to tackle the challenges posed by AI. Benson said, quote, "All of this is made real if the federal government gave us money to hire someone to just handle AI in our states and similarly educate voters about how to spot deep fakes and what to do when you find them. That solves a lot of the problems. We can't do it on our own." End of quote. In August, the Federal Election Commission took a procedural step toward potentially regulating AI-generated deepfakes in political ads under its existing rules against fraudulent misrepresentation. Though the commission held a public comment period on the petition brought by Public Citizen, it hasn't yet made any ruling. Social media companies have also announced some guidelines meant to mitigate the spread of harmful deep fakes. Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, announced earlier this month that it will require political ads running on the platforms to disclose that they were created using AI. Google unveiled a similar AI labeling policy in September for political ads that play on YouTube or other Google platforms. So once again, the laws are trying to catch up to the technology, and I hope it does very soon. We're out of time for this week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.